Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this ACRL Access Services Interest Group 2020 Spring Virtual Forum. I am Renice Johnson, Head of Access Services System Librarian at Morgan State University, and joining me on monitoring the chat window today is Joanna Messer-Kimmett. She is the User Services Coordinator Liaison Librarian at California State University, Dominguez Hill. Today's session will introduce the principles of universal design and explain how applying them in libraries can improve accessibility and inclusion. We are pleased to have Carly Spina, Associate Professor, Head of Research and Instructional Services at the Fashion Institute of Technology, presenting today. Thank you for being here with us, Carly. Whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. Today, I will be talking about universal design and ways that it can help you to improve inclusion. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a really quick background about me. So I have a background that's sort of a mix of law, librarianship, and education. And throughout all of that, I've been really interested in accessibility. And particularly, I did classwork about accessibility and universal design as part of my master's in education. And so that got me really interested in how libraries can apply these principles to make the library a more inclusive space for all. And since then, I've been trying to encourage libraries to adopt this through professional development. So I hope that this will help you to feel like you can really go from this session to applying these thoughts at your library. So first, I want to start off by having an understanding of sort of what accessibility is and how that compares to universal design. So when we say accessibility in the United States, at least, I think people often think of the Americans with Disabilities Act, because that really imposed a standard of accessibility legally on a lot of libraries as public institutions, public accommodations. And that certainly is a piece of what accessibility is. But even when it's more broadly defined, accessibility tends to be about taking a space or an environment or a service and trying to make it accommodate people with disabilities. And so this picture shows an example of this, which is the idea of you have an existing staircase and you decide that that's not accessible for people with disabilities. And so the solution to that is to install what we see here, which is a chairlift. Now, that does improve accessibility. It offers access to people who use wheelchairs to navigate a staircase that they would not otherwise be able to. However, it does still provide only a certain level of access. And solutions like this, while they are sort of the cornerstone and a really iconic example of accessibility improvements, are still exclusionary. And what I mean by that is, first of all, they require people to have access to special technology that can break down, that may require special knowledge to operate it. And these may seem like minor things, but I'll give an example that one time I was temporarily using a wheelchair and I went to a movie. And when I went to the movie, they took me up in the chairlift. And then while I was in my movie, the only person who knew how to use the chairlift left for the night. And so I was upstairs and no one really knew how to maybe get back downstairs. And it worked out, but it's sort of one of the things about why maybe this isn't as inclusive of an approach. And another thing about this that's not as inclusive is that for people who have other types of mobility impairments, this doesn't offer access. So someone may have a mobility impairment that makes it impossible for them to walk up the stairs, but they may still walk. Perhaps they use a cane, perhaps they have limited ability to walk. And for the most part, a lift is not something that's usable by those folks because it will not be stable enough for someone to stand on. It's really only intended for somebody who's in a wheelchair. So universal design looks at things sort of from the opposite direction. Universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And that's directly a quotation about it from the person who coined the term, Ronald L. Mace. You can see a picture of him here. He was an acclaimed architect who also himself used a wheelchair because he had polio. And really universal design was about taking sort of the conception of it that people usually have and historically have had, which is that you're going to take an existing design and you're going to redesign it to try to allow some amount of access. And instead, it swaps that around and says, how can we go from the initial design stage and try to make this something that's inclusive for everyone? And it's important to know that usually designs won't be able to be inclusive for absolutely every single person, but it's about designing with all people in mind so that you can improve that inclusion. And so the way you can think about it is a lot of times when we're talking about accessibility, again, particularly under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the first level and lowest level of access is an accommodation. An accommodation is where there's something that's not accessible and a person with a disability comes in and says, because I have a right to this, because I have a disability under the law, you have to do something to help me with it. So an accommodation in a library might be something along the lines of, you have only access to a certain section of your collection via stairs, and an accommodation would be saying, okay, well, if someone comes to the desk, someone will page those books for them, but they have to have a doctor's note or be on a list of people who are eligible for that service. Accessibility in that situation might be, as we discussed, adding a chairlift. And universal design would be rethinking the entire way that you've designed your collection layout so that everyone can access all of it. So if you think of it that way, it sort of is, accommodation is the lowest level in terms of inclusion because it requires the most hoops for someone to jump through. Whereas universal design is everyone meets the design in a way that they can equally use it. So who benefits from this? Well, I think a lot of times when people think of universal design, they think of people with disabilities. And that is a huge portion of it. That's a big part of why the concept was developed. And that is a big part of the population, though. I think people often overlook that because sometimes people aren't able to make use of services if they're not already accessible. But worldwide, about 15% of the population has disabilities, and about 40 million Americans have disabilities. So that is a big population that benefits. But it also benefits other people. It benefits older adults who may have declining vision or declining physical ability, but may not think of themselves as disabled, or may not qualify as having a disability. It helps non-native English speakers. We're going to talk about how some of what is included in universal design really is about different ways of perceiving information. And that really is more inclusive for people who maybe speak different languages. And much of it also is very helpful in accommodating people who are just distracted or who are maybe moving quickly, because it has a focus on making things easy to use and intuitive to use. So then what we're really talking about here isn't designing specifically for people with disabilities, but instead trying to make a single design responsive to the needs of a wide array of people going through their lives with a lot of different circumstances that may even be invisible. So universal design is, again, really just about this inclusion, but let's talk about where you actually see it in the real world. Well, one of the quintessential examples, and actually this is something that even predated the term universal design, is the idea of a curb cut. So we've all seen those, and they were in many ways initially designed to accommodate people with disabilities. But they also help within a lot of other scenarios. If you're pushing a wheelchair, if you're pushing a stroller, if you're somebody who uses a wheelchair or crutches, if you're somebody who's pushing a hand truck, in all of these scenarios, the curb cut can be useful. So what are some other day-to-day examples of universal design that you can think of? You can feel free to put some in the chat if you would like, but I'm sure there are probably things that you see every day that are great examples of universal design, because a lot of places are starting to think more to this direction. So somebody mentioned housing. That's a big one. Elevators are a good example. Closed captioning is a really great example, particularly because that's something that has started out as an accessibility item in some ways, but it really is something that now is used in all sorts of settings, noisy bars, people who just prefer to have both on, someone listening to a tutorial in a quiet part of the library. And somebody mentions automatic doors, which is actually one of my quintessential examples. Particularly when you're someplace like a grocery store, an automatic door is a great innovation for everyone because everyone's carrying a lot of bags or pushing a cart even. People might be using a wheelchair. People might have a stroller with them. Regardless, it's just much easier to use. Another example that may be so common that people don't even notice it anymore is actually this lever style of doorknob. So people are probably familiar with the older style of sort of circular doorknobs, but those require a free hand. They require manual dexterity with that hand. And so these lever styles, which were originally designed for both aesthetics and improved access, are really a great innovation and have taken off in a lot of different locations. Because how many of us have probably, while carrying a stack of books, just opened this with our elbow? You can open it easily, even if you can't grab it with your hand, you can just push on it. So it makes it much easier to open and close the door. So what about some specific examples in libraries? Well, one really good example is this is from a university library. And you'll see here that they actually have a map that is color coded. It has icons that try to make it clear what's in different locations. And it also has Braille. So they have the full gamut of different ways that they could convey this information. And in fact, you might even be able to think of other ways you could add even more access. So if you were in a bilingual community, perhaps you might add another language as well. Or you might have this be something that was available both digitally and also in a sign like this in a library. So let's talk about what the 7 principles of universal design actually are. This is sort of the 7 pieces that you need to think of when you're doing a universal design project. And we're going to go through examples of each of these, but first let's just talk about what they are. So first, there's equitable use. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You want to make sure that everyone can equally use something. You want to make sure that there doesn't need to be necessarily a special solution for some people. Flexibility in use is very helpful because it not only helps access, but it can really help a lot with future proofing as well. Simple and intuitive use. Perceptible information, which that tactile sign we saw was a good example of. Tolerance for error, which basically means you want to make sure that there isn't going to be something that is, if you make an error, there's a large consequence that can't be solved. Low physical effort, which the doorknob would be a good example of. And size and space for approach and use, which is one example that can be most considered to be focused on sort of people with disabilities, I think, because this is one that's often meant for people who use crutches or you maybe use a wheelchair. But in all honesty, it really does apply to everyone because it can also mean if you are, if you are somebody with a stroller, if you're somebody who's not the average height, that can also apply there as well. So let's look at some examples of how these can actually be put in practice. So equitable use is all about trying to make sure that everyone is able to use a space or a service together without need for separation. So a really great example of this is the Getty Museum, and it is built around a slowly ramping upward spiral. And there are stairs and there is an elevator. So there are alternatives for folks who don't want to walk up the ramp. But the main purpose and the main exhibit space is built on this slow ramp so that everyone takes this path. And this is really great because it means that every single person is able to traverse the museum in the same way. They can follow the same path, they can follow the same exhibit as it goes along, and they don't have to continually feel as if they're having to separate out from the group and go to a secondary location often not as nice in order to gain access. So again, when I've used a wheelchair in the past, many times you would go somewhere and yes, they might have an elevator. But I mean, I've literally been through kitchens because the elevator was a elevator that was really only meant for staff. And oh yeah, you can use it, but you have to go back through this disused hallway, or you have to go through the kitchen. And it really felt like you were being forced to be separated from your group and to go out of your way, and you were having sort of not as nice of an experience as of the space. And while that might seem like a minor point, it really can, especially over time, just change how you view the organization. It's not as enjoyable, it's not as inclusive, it's not as meaningful of a experience for you. You don't feel like a welcome guest. Whereas if you can build a scenario where everyone can use it in the same way, everyone can use it together, then you manage to foster more types of collaboration, and you manage to foster this sense that everyone is on equal ground with one another. So flexibility in use. And I think this one is one that's really helpful to think about for design projects, even aside from accessibility. Because really, often there are ways that you could maybe do things a little bit differently or allocate resources slightly differently. And through that, offer greater flexibility. And that really is something that can help to make sure that a project remains relevant and useful through time. So this example is an example of a door that has an accessible doorknob, but it also, acknowledging that not everyone may even be able to use that type of doorknob, also has an automatic door button. But another example of this that I think is really relevant for libraries is furniture. So if you're buying a table, let's say, and you have an option to spend $100 to get a table with the top size that you need, that's a single height, versus $110 to get one that can be adjustable heights, a lot of times it makes sense to advocate for getting the more adjustable table, because then if you end up having a program for kids, you can lower it. If you end up wanting to have it at podium height, you can raise it. If you end up having to have it at the ADA compliant height for people who are using wheelchairs, you can put it at that specific height. But often I think that's just not even considered when people are purchasing furniture or setting up facilities that build in this level of flexibility and think about how different users might have different needs, but also how the library might have different needs for different types of programs. Another good example of this is that a lot of libraries are sort of stuck at this point with stacks that were bolted into the ground pre-Americans with Disabilities Act. And so now they can never make their shelving accessible. And certainly that's something that maybe there are reasons why there was no other alternative, or they were built 100 years ago and it wasn't even a consideration. But when you're undertaking new design projects, it's a real opportunity to think about, well, how might we be able to build in the option for making changes in the future, so that if there is a change need that we can't even contemplate right now, we have that ability to be flexible and nimble. Simple and intuitive design. And I think this is something that libraries are always really striving for, and really designers in general are striving for. But again, it's something to really think about. And you basically want your design to be something that doesn't involve a lot of thought. So looking at this example of this defibrillation unit, they know that the people using it are going to be probably under a great deal of stress. They know that they probably aren't going to be, hopefully, using it frequently. And so it's meant to be very intuitive. There aren't many options, for example. So you'll see that there's really only one major button, and there's even an arrow to that button. It's got pictorial diagrams, so it's not assuming that someone might speak any particular language. It has the diagrams repeated in 2 different places, so that if someone automatically looks in one location or another, they will know, what either way the information that they need. And I think that thinking about design in a way that you want to try to make it pared down and simple. And this goes along with what we're going to talk about in a minute about the principle of having there be a low cost for making errors. You really want to try to make things as low pressure as possible so that they're not taxing on a person, either in terms of building up stress or in terms of simply being something that feels overwhelming. And so they don't really even want to try to contend with it. This will make things more accessible for people who have perhaps cognitive disabilities, but more than that, it's really just going to make it a better user experience because it's really something that is necessary for all users at some point or another. We've all been stressed when we're trying to do something and found it more difficult than usual. We've all been trying to multitask and thinking that we're doing it effectively, and then maybe not really having it be effective when we go back and look later. And just trying to make sure that wherever possible, you're thinking about if somebody were totally new to this and they walked up, what would be, how would this look? And a good example of that is something like an elevator design. There's no reason that elevator up and down buttons have to be vertically oriented with the up button on the top. You could just as easily do them horizontally oriented, and occasionally you will see those, or you could even swap them so that the up arrow was on the bottom. But of course, that wouldn't be intuitive. And so it's become sort of the norm that they tend to be vertical with the up arrow on top. And because of that, you can walk up to an elevator and you can push a button without even thinking about it. And when I used to live in Boston, there was a subway stop that I went to sometimes, and the elevator only had one button, and then the second button that looked like it should be to go the other direction because the elevator only went to one floor, and the second button that you really mentally wanted to be the button to go down was actually the emergency help button. And I pushed that more than once, and I'm sure many people did because I wanted to go down and I saw two buttons, so I pushed the one on the bottom. And that's sort of the type of thing you want to think about is what will or won't be intuitive about this, and what are the ramifications if something isn't intuitive. And that goes along really well with perceptible information. You want to try to make things understandable to people on a lot of different levels. So this sign I've always thought is a really great example of this. This was the University of York. They designed a whole series of signs, actually. They not only had these large signs, but they also had little standees on the tables in the different zones that they had created. And for the zones, they have a title, which is designed to make it apparent what it means. So silent zone, very apparent what that means. Then below that, they have a little bit more detail in a smaller font, but that's not necessarily really necessary. It's just if you're somebody who wants to know exactly what they intend by silent zone. But then in addition to that, they have these icons that represent the same information at a glance without even having to read. So if you don't speak English, if you're just walking by and you don't really have the mental bandwidth to be able to read the sign, you can just glance at it and say, okay, I see that person up there is quietly thinking to themselves, so this is a silent zone. And then they also have the check mark, which both represents positive or negative as a check mark or an X, but also with the green and red color. That one is particularly an important element of the sign because too often people represent yes or no or good and bad with just red and green. But of course, for somebody who might be colorblind, that's going to present an issue. So here, every time they use red to represent no, they also use the X. And so you see that for each of the elements of the sign, they're really trying to give you more than one way that you might get the information quickly that the sign is trying to show you. And that is really a nice way of having something be accessible to people who speak multiple languages, people who are distracted, and just everyone at once. People who are colorblind can use the sign. Everyone can really walk up and know what's intended here. Now, tolerance for error, I put this in because it's a library example, but I'll also talk about another example. So this is a great example of tolerance for error. it's in many, many library systems at this point. And what that is spelling correction. Did you mean function that we've probably all encountered in our catalogs, in our discovery systems, in Google. And I think it's just a really nice and very supportive feature because it's not necessarily saying that someone did spell something wrong, but it's trying to help them out. And if you're not sure how to spell a word, now you've got a helpful tool that will get you to your end result either way. And it's going to let you know what it is that you want. But another example that I've used in the past for this and that I really like is the fact that if you picture a water cooler, you can probably picture the fact that the water coolers, all that you've used, even if you've never really realized this, probably everyone that you've ever used has had hot water on the same side and cold water on the same side. And they've also had, probably most of them do, a feature that means that you have to do 2 steps before you can get the hot water. And this is really a great example of design for tolerance for error. They're trying to minimize the chances, both through the positioning and because of the number of steps you have to take to access the hot water, of someone wanting cold water and instead pouring scalding hot water onto themselves or into their cup or whatever it may be. And that's another really nice example of how you've got something that could be potentially a little bit dangerous. And so you make sure that you're designing it in a way that there's no way that someone could inadvertently use it, or at least that you're minimizing the chances that someone is going to inadvertently use it incorrectly. Another really great example of this is online when you have a moment to confirm that you want to do something. When you're booking something and you get either a confirmation screen before you submit, or even when you get a confirmation email after the fact. That way, if something went wrong, you are on notice of that fact and you can still correct it before there might be a larger problem. Low physical effort. This one is another one that's very focused, I think, on people who are maybe with disabled or older, or for whatever reason, maybe don't have as much physical strength, but it's still very useful, I think, in just streamlining everyone's day. So this is a really nice example of a plug that's designed so that you don't have to have the manual dexterity and the strength to grab the small plug. You can instead just loop your finger through it and pull it out. But there, I think, are lots of examples. In some ways, an automatic door could also be an example of low physical effort as well, because if you are using a wheelchair, opening a door can be extremely difficult. So anytime you can lower the physical effort necessary, that can be very helpful. And then size and space for approach and use. I think that the 2 really quintessential examples of this in libraries in my mind are desks. And you can see here that this is a desk that's designed so that there are spaces where someone could stand, but also places where someone who is using a wheelchair could approach the desk. But there's also a really good example, I think, in how we set up the self-service equipment that we have in our spaces. But what by that I mean printers, copiers, any of those. So often that we have only a small space to put them, and so we put them all very close together. But instead, we need to be thinking about, okay, if someone came in with their child in a stroller, would they be able to approach this without having to leave their child several feet away? If someone was using a wheelchair, would they be able to use the copier? If someone was using a wheelchair and was using the copier, would anyone else be able to get to the printer next to it? Having that sort of thought process in mind can really change the way that you think about your space design. And I would also encourage you, for all of universal design, but particularly I think for the size and space for approach and use piece, too often, even if people are doing a universally designed project, when they get to something like this, they really focus on the patron side of things. And of course, we want patrons to have a great experience, but there are these needs amongst our staff and our colleagues as well. And so you also want to think about this not just from the perspective of patron use and patron comfort, but also, will staff be able to use it? Will staff have flexibility and size and space for approach and use? And that can often be overlooked, but it's really something to keep in mind whenever you're doing a design project. So there are some limitations and cautions to keep in mind when you are thinking about universal design and how you might undertake this work at your library. So I'd love to know in the comments in the chat whether or not there are any potential limitations that you're seeing. And then we'll talk about some that I think are very real, not just in libraries, but everywhere. But I'll just give you a couple of seconds to put any in the chat that you're already having questions about or seeing as potential issues. So this is my favorite picture to show as an example of a potential issue with trying to take a universal design approach to things. And what I'm really meaning to represent here is the idea that too often designers think about inclusion, but they don't necessarily involve people with disabilities in the process. And they think about inclusion simply from the point of view of I have X space or I have X service, and I want to make sure that it's something that's accessible to people with disabilities. And they maybe don't think as much about whether or not they're actually offering good user experience to everyone. And so while on paper, it might sound like it's universal design, in reality, it doesn't offer a usable experience, possibly for anyone. So this staircase is an example. And the reason why I think it's such a good example of it is because it looks very intriguing. I'm sure the architects were pretty excited about it because it is visually very, like, I think it actually looks kind of cool. However, as someone who has mobility impairments and has used a wheelchair, and especially knowing that this is actually located in a location that gets snow, it seems terrifying to me because there's no real barriers. You could easily, if you were in a wheelchair, if you didn't make one of these corners, you're going down the stairs. If you are trying to use the stair portion of it and you have any sort of visual impairment, this is going to be extremely confusing and very much, very visually difficult to parse, and possibly is going to require you to walk back and forth and up and down the stairs. And just generally, it's sort of more cool than it is really, I think, usable or something that most people would feel comfortable with. So a normal ramp would have guardrails specifically to avoid sort of the danger that you can see in some of these areas that somebody might just all of a sudden go down a staircase. And that's not really possible with this design. And so you start to think, well, this might actually lower access in some ways, because if this was going to be not necessarily as an addition to a ramp, but instead of having another ramp, it's really going to be possibly an issue and people aren't necessarily going to feel comfortable with it. And I see that in the chat, somebody's asking about, does the ADA have something to do with the lack of handrails? And I would say there's two pieces to the answer. First of all, this exact example is actually not in the US. It's in, I believe, Vancouver. And the second piece of that is that unfortunately, and I think for me, even though I do this a lot, somewhat still surprisingly every time, there the even though the ADA exists and even though most major projects need to be reviewed for accessibility, a surprising number of accessibility issues can still fall through the cracks, which I think is another reason why universal design is really helpful. Because if you're not just thinking about like, okay, well, the architects or the construction team will catch all the accessibility problems, then really it's going to be a better outcome, because honestly, no one's perfect. And a surprising number of either ADA violations, just straight up ADA violations, or situations that maybe don't violate the law but are still extremely inaccessible, slip through all the time. And there have been some big examples of this recently, actually. One of the more well-known ones was that the Queens Public Library opened a new branch library that was very expensive, hugely looked forward to. Beautiful exterior, beautiful interior, and yet it just really wasn't quite up to standards in terms of inclusion. I think there's still a lawsuit outstanding about whether or not it actually violates the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I think everyone would acknowledge that it's not particularly inclusive, because there were parts of the collection that were only accessible via stairs. There was limited elevator service to areas that were used by a lot of people who had children in strollers. And just generally, it wasn't necessarily taken as an opportunity to think as inclusively as perhaps they might wish they had, I would guess. Though I don't actually know anyone who worked on the project as far as I know. But so it is something that still can happen. Um, so it's definitely something to think about. I also see somebody say that there are handrails on the side. And yes, I think the staircase would probably technically count as having handrails, but I meant more the ramp portion. Normally ramps also have handrails, but because the ramp traverses the stairs, there wouldn't really be a practical way of adding a handrail that wouldn't block people from actually using the stair as portion of this as well. I'm actually not even sure what to call this type of construction. It's not really a staircase. It's not really a ramp, but anyway. So moving on, limitations. So that was a little bit about one of the main limitations, which is the idea that you want people with disabilities to be involved so that their needs aren't subsumed by the needs of other people, so that their needs don't really become just more about like, oh, but this is a very nice looking solution, or their needs are really fully understood. Another problem is that in some settings, it can be difficult to implement due to competing priorities. And I think that just is, that's a difficult reality for everything. Anytime you have a limited budget, which basically all projects, particularly projects in libraries, have a limited budget to some degree or another, there's always going to be competing priorities and decisions about which you want to put your funding towards. And sometimes I think universal design, even if a project starts out intending to be universally designed, it can be seen as costly. A big one is that it's often confused with one size fits all. And a lot of times that's the criticism I see from people who aren't proponents of it, is that they think that it is a one size fits all approach and that it's not really going to meet everyone's needs. And with that goes the last point, which is that it's rarely actually universal. And the actual definition that I read at the beginning from Ron Mace acknowledges this, saying that it's going to be universally designed for people to the greatest extent possible. But reality is that it's not always going to be the case. And it has to be realized that it's not a failure of the project if in the end you design something from a universal design perspective and people still need accommodations. They will, because everyone has differing needs and disability is very unique person by person situation. So it's very likely that even if you have a universally designed space, you will get accommodation requests occasionally. And you do want to focus on who's being excluded and how when doing the design. But it's a good framework for trying to include people who maybe are normally overlooked, even if it's not a panacea that will solve the problem for everyone. So I would say that it's best to think of it, and this is a quotation from the Center for Excellence in Universal Design, in this way. Universal design is a process, not an outcome. It is not assumed or expected that 100% universal solution will be achieved or even is achievable for any given design. Rather, universal design should be a goal that a designer strives to achieve. And I would add to this that particularly in libraries, it should also be an iterative process that we are continually trying to improve on. As we do new design projects, as we develop new services, as we come up with new programming, we should always be looking at it as a time to improve inclusion, to gather feedback about people who feel that their needs aren't being met, and to really critically think about how we can make changes that will better include them in our library spaces and in our library services. So how can you bring universal design to your library? Well, I think that sometimes when people hear about universal design, they think it doesn't really apply to them because they think that that's like, okay, well, someday when we're able to tear down this, historic landmark building or completely gut renovate this 60-year-old space, then we can start thinking about universal design. But it really doesn't have to be that. And I think it's best actually, especially if not everyone in the team is on board, to try to start small and inexpensive and prove how it improves use. So, it can be free. You can do simple things like when you're already going to be printing a sign, thinking about how you can try to have representations visually that will show what is being conveyed by the sign, as well as having words. It can be something like looking at your existing printer setup and realizing that it really doesn't have the space for approach and use, and so moving them just a few feet. Or it can be just little tiny fixes, like adding an automatic door is often relatively affordable. You might be able to take an existing desk space that you have and add a separate table next to it that allows for use by people at different heights. All of these things can be done relatively inexpensively. And going back to the example that I mentioned about when you're buying furniture, it can be about saying, we're going to spend just that little bit more to get something that's more flexible and inclusive. That's universal design too, even if it's only buying a single table. And I recently talked to a library for a project I'm working on where what their universal design, their big universal design project was that they redesigned a workstation, a computer workstation, so that a single workstation was designed universally. And that meant that anyone would be able to use this workstation that was really essential to students being able to get their work done. And even that is a great example. It doesn't have to be that you're building a whole new library. It doesn't have to be that you're starting from scratch in a particular room or designing a new service. It can make small changes and they can make a huge impact. And so that also can be just rearranging, like I mentioned, and also evaluation. So another piece of it is, even if you're not able to do a redesign yet, start evaluating all of what you have so that you know what you would want to do if you're able to. You can create priorities and you can see where you might be able to make some changes. And make it a part of future purchases very explicitly and future projects. Create a checklist. And anytime you're going through a procurement process, maybe you can have as one of the steps along the way, considering it from a universal design perspective. Redesign your signage. That can be a huge improvement for a lot of people. It's something that libraries tend to do relatively regularly. So you don't even have to do it immediately. You can just say the next time we do it, if you do it on a 2 or 5 year cycle, just have it in the plan that the next time you redo all your signage, you're going to think about it that way. And also, if you are thinking like, man, this really makes me realize that we need to renovate X, Y, or Z space, explore grant opportunities. A lot of times there are either institutional funds that are available specifically for these types of projects. So in higher education, that might be an institutional grant that's available for greater inclusion. But there are also often local grants. Local governmental organizations in the US and in Canada frequently have grants that are specifically designed to make spaces more accessible. And if you can make the case why that would help you to have a greater impact on the community, you might be very competitive for that sort of grant. So it can also be a way of getting money, whether you already have a project in mind. Even if you already are going to be doing a project, you can sometimes get that additional funding so that you can afford to go the extra step to make it even better for all of your users. So with that, I wanted to leave the last 15 minutes for us to have a discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you have anything you would like to ask me. I also am going to be leaving you with my contact information. So if you think of any questions later or have any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the group, feel free to email me. My email's there, or contact me on Twitter. Either one, I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone might have about their specific workplace, or if you want to put me in touch with someone else wasn't able to attend but has questions, that's fine too. Yeah, so someone's bringing up in the chat the idea of having a mix of different chairs. And I think that that's also a really great idea just in general. If you aren't able to have necessarily flexible furniture, just having a mix of furniture can be really great. Soft and hard chairs, chairs of differing sizes, heights, arms and without arms, and also trying to have them be mixed up in different areas. So I think for aesthetic reasons, sometimes maybe a library has the quiet study space has entirely wooden chairs with arms, and the loud area of the library is all soft furniture and bean bags. And it's good to actually have there either be a mix or the clear message that people can move things around, so that people feel like they can use all the spaces. In some ways, so someone asked the question about COVID and whether or not it has had many impacts on universal design principles. I think in some ways, libraries that were already thinking about universal design were well positioned by before COVID because of the flexibility element. And I've had multiple libraries tell me how things that they did because they were looking at things from a universal design perspective really helped them as they transitioned to COVID. Things like how they already knew how to do accessible and inclusive online teaching, online events, but also in spaces, because it does aim to have that flexibility. So yeah, you may have to cut down on how many people you can accommodate and removing furniture and fewer elevators, but fewer people in elevators, but that's going to sort of impact everyone equally. And basically, when you're doing that, you just want to be thinking about it from a universal design perspective so that you're not removing, for example, all the chairs of a single type. Instead, you want to make sure that you're going to try to still maintain the fact that you have a diversity of options. And really, in some ways, redesigning for COVID can be done under this checklist of universal design, because it really does have a lot to offer in terms of making sure that signs are understandable from a greater distance if people can't get as close to them, for example. And size and space for approach really allows you to think about that space sort of information, which then also would lead nicely into thinking about like waiting in a line with 6 feet apart and how that changes the need for space for approach and use. So I think that it doesn't have to negatively impact it. It's just something that can work well in tandem, the redesign for COVID with thinking about universal design. So somebody's asking about universal design for learning in reading strategies for elementary students. So there are some really great resources on universal design for learning. I focused this presentation specifically on universal design, but universal design for learning is a specific framework that takes universal design and applies it in education settings. And it's some of the great resources I would recommend are, there's an organization called CAST, C-A-S-T. They have a lot of great information on their website. And the other resources I would recommend is there's a recent book called Equity by Design that is a really great book that looks at UDL and how it interacts with student equity. And I would really recommend that. It just came out this year. So highly recommend checking that one out for the student who's interested in it. Okay, so the next question, let's see here. Another thing that came up in a recent renovation was using carpet texture and color to help people understand walkway versus furnished area. Yes, so I would say that a lot of people use floor patterning, but it is important to keep in mind, as the person noted, that texture changes can make a trip hazard. They can also, depending on the type of, so there's a couple different problems you can have with carpeting. One is that they can be more difficult for wheelchair users. Sort of what you might think of as nice carpeting, so very plush carpeting, is actually very difficult to use if you are using a wheelchair, especially a manually powered wheelchair. And also, as somebody else kind of brought up, anything that's got a lot of patterning, particularly upholsteries and carpeting designs, can actually make people dizzy, or for people with visual impairments, can actually be very difficult for them to see and make sense of, and can very much disguise things like a step, for example. So you do want to be a little bit cautious about that. Somebody asked if there's any resources for universal design for signage. So universal design for signage, I haven't seen anything that I can think of off the top of my head that's solely related to signage. But I did recently write a piece for Public Services Quarterly about accessibility and universal design for graphic design more generally. And I talked about signage in there. So that might be one place you could look. And also there are some pieces about user experience, UX reviews of signage that maybe aren't specifically focused on accessibility, but I've thought are very useful in thinking about the usability of signage in particular. Yeah, so another thing people are bringing up in the chat, Laura is bringing up the idea of having lighting be controllable. That's very, very useful. And having spaces where people can control the light can be very difficult in some libraries, especially if you only have large overhead lighting. And if that's the case, there are a couple of tips I would have. One of which is, if you're thinking that people might need dimmer spaces, allocating a study room or individual groups or small group space specifically for people with that need, and they get a priority, can be an alternative, since sometimes even if the main library doesn't have individual controls, those rooms may. And at the flip side, if people need to have brighter lighting, especially, for example, if you have those type of older carrels that maybe have a shelf at the top that blocks some light, there are quite a few libraries that actually have circulating small lights that people can place on their workspace, so that if they need a brighter space, they can use those lights. And in fact, a couple of libraries even let students check those out and use them in their dorm room if they needed more lights for a short period of time. So there are ways, even if your library is not well set up, there are ways you can sort of work around the limitations of your space to offer more flexible lighting. Does anybody have any additional questions? Yeah, I've seen some libraries that circulate lights for SAD, but I think it can be a little bit difficult because there's a lot to go along with it if you want to do that. But I think, I can't think of which ones off the top of my head, but I think there are at least 2 or 3 academic libraries that are still doing that. Yeah, I think ring lights could be very popular, especially if you have any students who are people who do a lot of streaming on any of the video services like YouTube or TikTok. I think they would probably check them out every time they're recording a video. Ring lights are basically, they're They're actually circular lights, which is why they're called ring lights. And they are designed specifically for when you're recording yourself on video. And particularly, I see people talking about them a lot for like mobile video, when you're recording yourself on your computer or on your phone and posting that video. They're sort of a lower tech, lower cost way of approximating more professional lighting anytime you're going to be on a screen. They work pretty well from what I understand, but as you can probably tell, I don't have one. I just have regular lighting in my apartment. Any other questions? Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the pounding in the background, but my apologies. I have no idea why they suddenly started construction somewhere in my building right as I started this. So I'm not seeing any other questions, but just let me know if you think of any later. You can feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. I'm always happy to answer questions about universal design or other accessibility topics as well if people have any other questions.
Thank you so much, Carly. And on behalf of all of us in the ACRL Access Services Interest Group, please join me in thanking her for a presentation to us today. And also thanks to Gina Parsons-Diamond from ACRL for hosting our session and providing technical support. And we're so glad you made the time to be part of our first fall forum for 2020. And please join us again next Tuesday, November 17th at the same time, 1 p.m. Central, for a presentation by LaPortia Davis, Dr. LaPortia Davis from Morgan State University. In this session, Dr. Davis will report on her experience going from course reserves to open educational resources for her course. I've put the link for the registration in the chat for the Zoom session. I think I accidentally just sent it only to panelists. So let me do that again for everyone. Registration is open online now for the Zoom session. And if you have suggestions for what you would like to see in a future virtual forum for the Access Services Interest Group, please send them to us. Renise and I are looking for information and topics for future forums for spring. Once again, thank you so much, Carly, and we hope to see you again next week.
Thanks so much for having me.